May I just say that if this gentleman here doesn't laugh as loud as that when I'm speaking, I'll think I've done something wrong. So please, I mean, isn't that amazing? A round of applause for that. I mean, that's got to be one of the best laughs you've heard all year. Now, look, I want to start with an anecdote. The anecdote is, once upon a time, I went to Denmark. I was in Copenhagen. I was being interviewed by this journalist on one of the flagship news programs in Denmark. And she was a lovely journalist. I mean, she was being awfully polite and attempting very hard to be nice to me, but she messed up in something. And she said, you know, Mr. Nawaz, tell me about the immigrant experience in Britain. And I said to her, I'm sorry. She said, tell me about the immigrant experience in Britain. I said, I wouldn't know, I'm not an immigrant. And she said, what do you mean? I said, well, I was born there. And she said, oh, okay, I'm sorry. Tell me about what it feels like to be a minority in Britain. I said, okay, and I proceeded to attempt to answer the question as best as I could. And amidst that answer, I kind of spoke a lot about the need for the term Britain to be inclusive, to include everyone, to kind of, refer to people regardless of faith and color and ethnicity. Everyone can be British, just like everyone can be American. At which point, at the end of the interview, I can assure you I did answer for about 10 minutes. Perhaps that was too long for her to remember the beginning of the conversation. What she said next was, looking wonderfully impressed, I may add, she said, you see, what we need in Denmark is young, intelligent immigrants like you who are able to explain this to us. There we go. Got one there. Now, the reason I mention that is the following, that being British cannot be defined. But I would defy anyone in this chamber this evening to tell me that I'm not British. You cannot define the term, but it's a feeling. It's a sense of belonging. And I think that in this country, when compared to continental Europe, not meaning to disparage anyone from any particular country, I think that we have, with the term British, succeeded in achieving something close to the term American in that anyone can be British. Whether they are Muslim, Christian, Jewish, whether they are brown, black or white, or any other color or ethnicity or religion, anyone can be British because of this catch-all term, despite the fact we cannot define it. Now, what I don't want to do is deteriorate in this debate to the level of sixth form politics by name-calling and laying blows below the belt. What I will say, though, is that despite the fact, look, we can't define British. The Honourable Member said he believes in equality and human rights. I don't think we can define those terms either. It doesn't mean we shouldn't advocate them. It doesn't mean we should not advocate for gender equality, that we should not advocate for human rights and hold to account our own government when it violates these rights that we hold so dear to our very selves. Just because you can't define something, it doesn't mean it doesn't exist. Stalin killed Trotsky. That doesn't mean communism doesn't exist. Yes, they disagreed with each other over the definition of communism, but there is an ideology called communism. We feel it, we sense it, we know it exists. We may disagree over exactly what the purest form of communism is. I hope you don't kill me for that. So just because you can't define something, let's not return back to sixth form debates and say, therefore, it doesn't exist and we can't support it. So, it's a feeling. So what must we avoid in that feeling of what it feels like to be British? We must avoid doing certain things that make others feel excluded. Now, I've grown up among that entire milieu of feeling excluded in the years before the murder of Stephen Lawrence, in the years before the Macpherson inquiry that coined the phrase institutional racism in this country. I felt excluded. And yes, so I did join an Islamist organization. I did rebel against the establishment. And I went to prison for that and was duly adopted by Amnesty International as a prisoner of conscience because guess what? I didn't break the law neither here nor in Egypt. I rebelled against the status quo because I had Combat 18 chasing me with hammers, hitting my friends round the head with hammers and machetes because they told them they weren't British. But being British is a feeling. It cannot be defined, but you know it when you feel it. So how do we avoid making people feel they are not British? Well, one thing we can do is make sure that we don't stop and search them because of what they look like. Another thing we can do is make sure that we don't render them to be tortured, because that certainly doesn't make them feel British. Another thing we can do is make sure we do not deprive them of their right to silence in ports of entry and exit in this country by denying the right to silence and criminalizing it and making it a criminal offense to say I refuse to answer that question, and then forcibly taking their DNA from them. All of this has happened to me. That doesn't make someone feel British. Another thing we can do is make sure, guess what? Surprise, surprise, that we don't invade countries. Because the people whose fathers and mothers are from those countries won't feel very British when we illegally invade those countries. Because you'll be killing their cousins. Why do I mention all these examples? Because these examples are real examples that this country was engaged in. And it meant that many, many people didn't feel British. Now, we've heard the coalition government has been critiqued during the course of the honourable member's presentation. But it's this coalition government, for good or for bad, with many mistakes that have been made, and yes, Nick Clegg did break a pledge. But one thing they did do is remove all of those that I've just mentioned. They have pledged and acted on, making sure that we end detention without trial, rendering to torture, that we make sure that any bombardment of any country is legal and approved by Parliament. That's how you make people feel British. And if it is a feeling and not an academically defined term, I mean, for God's sake, we can't even define Oxford University. I mean, if we put a contest here and say, let's define the bricks and mortar that make up this building, we'll probably have as many definitions as people in this room. That doesn't mean we're not really in a building. So just because you can't define the term, it doesn't mean there's not a thing called a feeling. Yes, sir, I will not silence debate.
Thank you, sir.
I hope you feel part of this debate.
Thank you very much. Sir, do you believe that feeling British is sufficient to be British?
Feeling?
Do you believe that feeling British is what makes you British?
So there are a few conditions for. One of them, of course, is a citizen is a British citizen by law. Whether that citizen feels British or not, which is a different question to what we're discussing today, which is what should be promoted by the state. What I'm arguing is the state should promote that feeling because it's good for that person, the individual, it's good for the country, and it's good for democracy. So, thank you. So, what I'm arguing is, therefore, that any action that doesn't make our citizens feel British is an action that the state should avoid, and this coalition government, for good or for bad, for many criticisms that I personally have of the government, has indeed pulled back on most of what I just mentioned, including the right, denying the right to silence and criminalizing it in ports of entry and exit in this country. So what are those values? The feeling British and making people feel British because of the values of not doing what I've just mentioned are essentially small L liberal, small d democratic. Of course, if you want to make them big L and big D as well, you can. I have membership forms in my pocket. Human rights values. Yeah, second one there. Right? Human rights values. And by promoting those liberal, democratic human rights values, we make people feel part and parcel of this society. That's how we stop the up to 1,000 British born and raised fighters who have gone to join the worst terrorist group that history has ever known, ISIL. By encouraging people to participate in the democratic processes, not by shunning them. The only way people will participate is if there's a quid pro quo, if from both directions there's a process of integration and what it means to be British. Now, why did the Prime Minister choose the term British values? Well, I think that if a Conservative Prime Minister were to use the term liberal values, he'd probably be doing the junior partners in the coalition a favour, being that we are called the Liberal Democrat Party. And so let's not get hung up on those terms. Let's recognise the importance of feeling like one belongs in this country. And on my final note, considering that I have run out of time and I don't want to go over time, the final point to mention is this critique of the fact that if the state should promote a feeling of being British and the values underpinning that of inclusiveness and human rights and liberalism, what about the question of stagnation? What if 50 years ago the state were to promote the same thing, would that lead to homophobia and racism being frozen in time? No, I don't think so. If what I'm arguing here now is correct, and that it's about feeling included, then that's flexible enough to adapt with time. Because I tell you one thing, ladies and gentlemen, if you had said to me when I was 15 years old, growing up in Essex, facing Combat 18 and those hammers and machetes, with the genocide in Bosnia going on, the very angry teenager that I was, if you'd said to me that when you were 37, yes, I was 37 last Sunday, when you were 37, would you ever believe that there'd be an African-American president of the United States of America and that the conservative prime minister would usher in gay marriage equality? I would have laughed you out of this room as loud as that person there laughs in this debate.